Thanks. Staying here.
Thanks, Nick.
Okay, thanks very much. Do people know of a photographer called Nan Goldin? Anyone heard of Nan Goldin? Nan Goldin is a fabulous photographer, for those who don't know her. She documents life in the queer subculture in New York in the 1970s and 80s, and she does not gloss over the violence, the sex, and the drugs that was part of that subculture. So if you get a chance to go and see her, do check her out and maybe leave the kids at home. But the real low in Nan Goldin's life does not come through that subculture. It came in 2017. Because in 2017, Goldin was prescribed a painkiller for tendinitis in her left wrist. And she describes a downward spiral of addiction that started nearly overnight. She says this in an art magazine called Art Forum. I survived the opioid crisis. I narrowly escaped. I went from the darkness and ran full speed into the world. I was isolated, but I wasn't alone, because when I got out of treatment, I became absorbed in reports of addicts dropping dead from my drug, Oxycontin. So you might have heard of Oxycontin. There's some great TV dramatizations of what happened with the opioid crisis in America. I definitely recommend you check out Painkiller if you have a Netflix subscription. But what Goldin discovered when she came out of her own addiction was that around 300,000 people had died in the United States of overdoses associated with prescription opioids like Oxycontin. But she learned something else too, because as an artist, she'd obviously had her works displayed in art galleries and museums all around the world. And so she knew this name, Sackler, quite well. Lots of art galleries have a Sackler wing in them. They are huge philanthropists. But what she didn't realize was where the Sacklers' money came from. And as she said, I learned that the Sackler family had formulated, marketed, and distributed Oxycontin. The Sackler family and their private company, Big Pharma, built their empire with the lives of hundreds of thousands, and they then washed their blood money through the halls and museums and universities around the world. So Goldin became a full-time activist, trying to get Sackler's name removed from galleries and museums with no small amount of success. Now, the story she was telling goes back to the 1950s. A guy called Arthur Sackler, the head of the Sackler family. And Arthur Sackler, he didn't actually make drugs, but he kind of created a way of selling drugs which has become completely ubiquitous in the drug industry today. He basically recognized that if you want to sell a lot of drugs to people, you need to find figures of authority who we trust in society, like doctors. And if you can get in the heads of doctors, if you can convince doctors or scientists who write in academic journals, then we're going to trust them to prescribe us the drugs that they think can help us best. And so this is what he specialized in. He made a fortune for Pfizer. He really put it on the map as a company in the 50s when they were selling antibiotics. And then in the 60s, he did something really big. He sold a drug called Valium in this way. And Valium, obviously in the 1960s and 1970s, became, like, in many ways, the world's first blockbuster drug. And what he did was convince doctors that nearly everybody in society should be on Valium. You know, even if you have perfectly normal levels of anxiety. In fact, there's one advert I found for Valium which says, even if the patient has no signs, no psychiatric problems whatsoever, try Valium. So, you know, he went out of his way to say, everyone should be on this, it's going to do you all good. And by the way, there's virtually no addictive qualities to it whatsoever. So we know what happened with Valium, Mother's Little Helper in the 1970s, which made Roche, who produced that drug, an absolute fortune. His nephew, Arthur Sackler died in 1987. His nephew, Richard Sackler, then created a new drug called Oxycontin through his company, Big Pharma, that they'd set up. Now, Oxycontin is a very, very strong painkiller. It's not that it has no role in the health system, but it really is end of life or very serious cancer pain. But again, I mean, it's not that much different to heroin, to be honest, in terms of its levels of addictiveness and in terms of how strong it is. But like Valium, the Sacklers suggested virtually everybody, whatever their pain level, should have Oxycontin. And they went out of their way to explain Oxycontin is not addictive. In fact, they came up with their own term, opiophobia, to describe the unwarranted fear of using opioids because you're worried about the addictive qualities. And they went all around America selling this drug. They even created little, lovely little cuddly toys of an Oxycontin pill with little arms and legs and a head that sat in many pharmacies. And many people, it made Purdue Pharma about $1 billion a year in sales. It was a massive blockbuster. But it also got huge numbers of people addicted very quickly. Indeed, by 2019, 38 people a day were dying from overdoses of prescription opioids in the United States. 3/4 of Americans heroin addicts have stated that they started out by using prescription opioids like Oxycontin. So it's a massive scandal, which has really changed the way that Americans think about the pharmaceutical industry. Now, Purdue Pharma has now been disbanded. The Sacklers have been given very large fines, but they still walk free, and they're still very, very wealthy people. And what's worse, a new company has been started up to sell prescription opioids around the world in countries like China using the same techniques they used in the United States. Now, I'm going to finish on the opioid scandal there, because what I really wanted to say is so much of what you see in the opioid scandal, although it's extreme, is not that unusual in terms of how the pharmaceutical sector that we all depend upon for the drugs and medicines that we use when we're sick behaves. The pharmaceutical sector would like you to believe this was a one-off. The Sacklers were a bad apple. But don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Right? Don't over-regulate or constrain the power of the pharmaceutical industry, or you'll have no medicines, they want us to believe. But it wasn't. The Sacklers weren't a bad apple. There's another guy who I look at in my book called Martin Shkreli. Does anyone know Martin Shkreli? So Martin Shkreli, he's a young guy. He worked in a hedge fund until, by his own admission, he realized there wasn't enough money to be made in hedge funds. And so he started a pharmaceutical company. And Shkreli he's called the Pharma Bro because he really likes hip-hop music and thinks he's a pretty cool guy. And what he did was he worked out what drugs in society were already being produced. He didn't create drugs himself, drugs already on the market that had a monopoly, that he could buy and then squeeze as much money out of that monopoly as possible before anyone else could come onto the market and make the drug. So he bought one drug, pretty old drug, but an important one that deals with antiparasitic infections, particularly in immunocompromised people. So people who are HIV positive, pregnant women, if you get this really nasty parasitic infection, you need this drug. He bought it up, and he jacked up the price 5,000% overnight. So it was really hard to afford this drug anymore. When Shkreli spoke about, he became the most hated man in America for a while. He was so hated that Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, and Bernie Sanders all said this guy was absolutely out of control, and wasn't he awful? So he united that broad political spectrum. And when he did this interview, he said, someone asked him, "Do you have any regrets?" And he said, "I do." He said, "I regret not raising the price higher." Right, so Martin Shkreli then went on to say in that interview something really interesting. He said, "For all this moralism, I don't do anything that the rest of the pharmaceutical industry doesn't do." Right? He said, "My job is not to return a reasonable rate of profit to my shareholders. It is to maximize the rate of profit I return to my shareholders." And that's what everybody in this industry did and does. So Shkreli is interesting, I think, because, while again he's extreme, the way he behaved isn't particularly unusual. The difference about him is he did it with a smile on his face. The difference is he did it and bragged about it. Whereas what you mostly hear from the big pharmaceutical companies is different. What they say is, look, you might not like the way we behave, you might not like the prices we charge, but imagine a world without medicines. Imagine how frightening that is. And they've used that argument for decades now. Whenever there is any attempt to regulate or constrain the way that they behave, that's the argument they use. Imagine a world without medicines. It's frightening. But what I found was most interesting when I was researching the book is it isn't true. Because pharmaceutical companies today are actually far more like Martin Shkreli than they are Arthur Sackler. And what I mean by that is, very often, they don't invent medicines. They've almost forgotten how to invent medicines. In fact, pharmaceutical companies today are far more like hedge funds than they are medical research and development companies. So most of the drugs that are on the shelves that we depend upon, and this includes the COVID vaccines, right, that we all depended upon a few years ago, are not really invented by the companies that bear their names. That important work is done in universities, is done in small biotech companies, and is done with huge amounts of public money that we put in. What then happens is the big pharmaceutical companies, the names that you probably know, like Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, AbbVie, they then buy up the intellectual property that's been put into that research, paid for with our money, and they squeeze as much as they possibly can out of that intellectual property through the monopolies that gives them. And so we end up as a public paying twice for these drugs. Once, because we have to do the research ourselves, because the pharmaceutical industry won't do it. Secondly, because we have to pay the ludicrous prices that they charge, which are so great that they're causing a sustainability crisis for the National Health Service. And as if that wasn't enough, you know, these companies are really not doing the job that we need them to do, which is dealing with diseases that are killing hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people a year, because the companies have no interest in researching drugs for diseases primarily suffered by poorer people living in poorer countries. They have no interest in researching drugs to deal with future pandemics or epidemics, because that's very risky. The thing's unlikely to happen. In fact, they have no interest in researching any drugs that they can't make absolute blockbuster profits out of. And I argue that that's a real problem, and that if we want to create a health system which does create medicines that we need that could save millions of lives, we need a different way of doing it. And I'll end by giving you a little bit of hope, because that's a pretty depressing message. Because one of the things I found when researching the book is there are people all over the world actually doing things differently. The first guy that I talked to is called Peter Hotez, and he works for the Texas Children's Hospital. And he and his fellow scientists have got a unit there where they create drugs that the pharmaceutical industry isn't interested in. In fact, you haven't heard about it in all likelihood, but they created their own COVID vaccine. They created a COVID vaccine with no public support whatsoever, which explicitly didn't carry any intellectual property or any patents. They said, we want to give this to any country that can make it safely. And they gave around 100 million doses in Indonesia and India, which made a massive difference. I mean, more than Moderna sold in the whole of the developing world. He says, look, we don't believe in profiting from this stuff. We help develop it. And then the countries themselves and the companies we work with, they own it. We're hands-off. We don't meddle in their business. We're very much a believer in the concept of decolonization. There were then a bunch of scientists in South Africa, and they tried to make a COVID vaccine too, an mRNA vaccine. And they went to the companies that owned that technology, Pfizer and Moderna, and said, will you help us? And those companies said, no, we will not help you because we want to cling on to this technology because we believe it's not just important for COVID, it's important for all sorts of other things. Maybe even an HIV vaccine they're talking about now. Maybe a vaccine for certain types of cancer. So we want that technology. So the scientists in South Africa said, well, we're going to do it anyway. And within a few months, they cracked it. It still takes a long time from the point at which you know how to create a vaccine to actually creating the thing that can go in people's arms. But still, they did it fairly quickly. They're now working on a TB vaccine. But then they said, we're going to do something really different. We're going to do something really radical here. We're not going to patent this. We're going to share it with every country and company around the world who we believe can safely use this stuff. And they've already shared it with 15 companies. A radically different way of producing medicines. And the final example is from the belly of the beast in many ways, the United States, where pharmaceutical companies have been able to behave however they want, essentially, for decades now. And finally, the situation was so bad, caused partially by the opioid crisis, that things have really started to change. And President Biden, when he put forward his Inflation Reduction Act 2 years ago, put stuff in saying, we need to constrain the prices of these pharmaceutical companies. We need to begin to negotiate with them. And the pharmaceutical companies went apoplectic with rage about this. And they sent an email to every member of Congress. And they said, we are an extremely well-resourced industry. We are watching how you vote on this. And some of them were threatened, but he got it through by one vote. And in August this year, he sent out a tweet saying, this time we beat Big Pharma. And he has begun negotiating drug prices for the first time in American history at a federal level. He's got 10 lawsuits against him because how dare he interfere with the God-given right of big business to make whatever profits it wants. But nonetheless, he's going ahead with it, and I think he'll lose those lawsuits. So everywhere in the world, there is a recognition that this industry, which we're so dependent on in so many ways, is not doing the job we set it up to do. And so my book is explaining why that's the case, but also trying to give people hope that something different is possible. After all, most people in this country accept that our health system, our health services, the way we're treated when we're ill, is provided publicly, for free, at the point of use, universally accessible to everybody who needs it. If that's how we treat our health services, why do we allow the drugs that are given out by nurses and doctors in that health service to be produced in the most ultra-capitalist way you can possibly imagine? I think it's possible to change this system. I think it's possible for a system that is far better equipped to deal with the health challenges of all of us, all human beings in the 21st century. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Nick.